The Spinder-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am March Hunter, the host of the program. Our American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from its beginning to the present. And today we want to welcome back as our very special guest, Dr. George Anderson. So, Dr. Anderson, thank you for coming back to the show.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Dr. Anderson has written a fabulous book called Guaranteed to Fail. Socialism does not work because socialism cannot work. And Dr. Anderson, we have had on several times talking about his book. And I've asked Dr. Anderson to come back today to speak on the positive side of that, which is capitalism. So, Dr. Anderson, could you share with our listeners a little bit of your background, and then we'll get into the ideas of capitalism and the history of it and where we are with capitalism in America today?
Well, thank you very much again. I am a retired college professor and a retired disabled veteran. I served, I'm proud to serve my country for 20 years. And the disabled part is a little grandiose. The guns of the tank, shot my hearing. So I'm not as bad as some, but when I say, I'm sorry, what did you say? It's because I really didn't hear. I have a PhD in organization and management from Capella University. My undergraduate degree was from the Citadel. While other people were burning down the ROTC buildings, I was attending ROTC. During that late 60s, early 70s period, we were sort of the odd men out. Never really thought I'd make it past Vietnam, but here I
am. George, when your wife talks to you, can you claim that hearing disability, or is that just an excuse just to avoid listening and being told what to do?
No, it's clinically proven, although I must admit it comes in handy on occasion.
George, now I consider myself a historian / minor economist. Do you consider yourself a major economist / minor historian, or am I way off base by asking you that question?
Well, you're certainly not off base asking the question. It's not one I've given a great deal of thought to. I was a history major in undergrad, had an outstanding education from the Citadel, and I rolled it into the study of organizations and management, which, if it seems that those two dots don't connect, they really don't. I have no idea how that happened. But if you look at human development is very much the story of organizational development. If we have someone in the Stone Age, they can be perfectly nice people. They make their own clothes. They make their own weapons. They do a little farming. They do some hunting and fishing. They are totally self-sufficient. Maybe they get together a couple of families and they live in the same village for mutual protection. But it's not a terribly sophisticated organization. If you look at something like the modern orchestra, as you sit there in the audience looking at that orchestra, you are looking at the sum total of maybe 10, 15,000 years of human experience coordinated into a single performance. That takes a lot of human effort and a lot of human organization.
Mm-hmm.
So the story of civilization and the development of the history of man is the story of increased organizational ability. And I found that fascinating, and that's all I have to say about that.
One of the things, George, that I loved about President Reagan was that President Reagan promoted democracy, promoted capitalism, rather than just always trying to refute or defend a position. And I feel that oftentimes today, where we seem to be on the defense with fighting against socialism, fighting against what we see going on in Congress. And I believe part of our message is being lost because we're not really actually promoting what capitalism is. And do you agree with that statement, or do you have a different point of view with that?
No, I very much agree. Ronald Reagan, I had the honor and privilege of meeting him a couple of times. He was certainly one of the giants in American history. The story of top-down socialism, top-down autocracy, someone at the top telling the people what to do, is a pretty old song in the human experience. There's a cliche that Plato's Republic is the socialist Old Testament, and Karl Marx's Das Kapital is the New Testament of the socialists.
Huh.
They both talk about a highly structured society. They both talk about the elite guiding and directing the economic, political life of all the members of the society. Top-down autocratic socialism is a long story in the human experience. What is revolutionary, although it's familiar to us because we've been in it our entire lives, but what is revolutionary in 4,000 years of human history was the American Revolution and the concepts of the rights of the individual. That was very much made possible by the parallel track of free enterprise and capitalism, where wealth was created from the bottom, not the top. They're the two rails of the track. They're the two parallel lines. You can't have one without the other.
And before the American Revolution, share with our listeners, what was most of the economies in Europe, before the American Revolution? Then I have a follow-up question for you.
Well, not just of Europe, most of the economies of the world were top-down. The king, the emperor, the chief literally owned the country and everything in it. Think of the story of Robin Hood. How dare you go out and shoot one of the king's deer, even if you want to eat? That's not your deer. That's the king's deer. How dare you squat on that piece of land? That's not your land. That's the king's land. From the top to the bottom, every decision was made in regard by the king. The king would pass out areas of responsibility, not for ownership, but he would give the Baron of East Jabip a piece of property to hold for the king. The Baron of East Jabip got his wealth by the granting from the king. It was totally top down. And if you were at the bottom of the stack, you had nothing.
And during the colonial time period in America, what was the economic system that the colonists lived under?
Well, if you remember, it was initially very similar to what they found in Europe. The 13 colonies were largely land grants to a specific individual to go hold for the king. Our local patriarch, William Penn, got Penn's Woods not because he'd ever been here, he'd never been to the United States, but the king gave him the territory, which is now Pennsylvania, to hold for the king. He was the king's representative. People came after him. Now, obviously, as a Quaker, Penn brought an entire new perspective to that job. And all of a sudden, people truly had religious liberty and truly were able to go out and take a deer without worrying about whether the king was going to get upset or not. So we here in Pennsylvania had a sort of unique experience. But that, the fact that if you look at Maryland, if you look at almost any of the other colonies, they were almost all derived from the direction and the contract of the king. There was a metamorphosis over the colonial period, though, because if you didn't like it, you just moved another 10 miles west and you founded your own village. You founded your own space. There wasn't anybody there to tell you you couldn't. It wasn't about money. If you look at our frontier heroes, they weren't dressed in buckskin because they had a lot of money. They were dressed in buckskin because they just killed the damn deer, they skinned it, they cured it, and they wrapped it around themselves. These guys were not wealthy. These guys were not the elite. But these guys were formed by the frontier. They were independent. They didn't need anybody's permission. They created their world out of a wilderness. And that was totally new. That frontier experience was totally new, pretty much to the world. There hadn't been a frontier in Europe since God knows when. So that all of a sudden, the hierarchy of the colonies was not able to exercise power and authority like the hierarchy in England. Your local duke said, do this in England. If you didn't do it, there was no place to run. If the local guy in the United States said, do it, and you didn't like it, you said, bye, guy, and you were gone. And there wasn't anything you could do about it. It bred an entirely different national personality.
George, where do we first begin to see capitalism appearing as an economic system?
The first, we like to think it was here in the United States, but in fact, the first big historic appearance was in Holland. Strangely, again, the Pilgrims had that stop in Holland on the way to the New World, and they picked up a couple of things. Capitalism is nothing. The definition of capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production. That's the definition of capitalism. In Europe, if you put up a mill to grind wheat, it wasn't your mill, it was the king's mill. In the United States, if you put up a mill to grind wheat in the colonial period, guess what? It was yours. And you could do with it as you please. Capitalism took another step. What happens when there are two partners? Or better, or bigger, what happens if you don't have the money for the mill, but you got everybody in the village together and everybody kicked in? Right. Then the whole village owns it, but who knows who owns how much? So it became the idea of having a stock company and combining little pieces of money or capital into a large block to allow a large product or a large process really got going here in the United States. I happen to be the proud owner of one share of the Philadelphia to Lancaster Turnpike. People don't remember that the main highway between Philadelphia and Lancaster, Pennsylvania, at one time was a private enterprise, And I've got a share of it. I keep thinking I'll put up a turnstile on Route 30 and see how much money I can collect, but that may not work.
Well, maybe your wife will put up a turnstile for you to go into the laundry room and do some laundry.
She gave up on that years ago.
Okay, because she would go bankrupt with that. After the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention, did our founders purposely want a capitalistic economic system, or is that something they just gradually fell into?
What our founders wanted was the rights for the individual. They had a belly full of the king dictating. And interestingly, they set up a whole system of checks and balances so that no one individual would ever be powerful enough to dictate. Interestingly, it very closely resembled the old Roman institution of the Roman Republic. That freedom was the impetus and provided the driving force for free market capitalism. I don't think, especially the Southern plantation owners, they weren't thinking in terms of, hey, 50 years from now, we'll all have stock companies, and I think that was much too far of a reach. But what they were absolutely dedicated to were the rights of the individual. And as they are parallel lines in establishing the rights of the individual, you create a free market economy.
With the free market economy, what drives capitalism as a system?
Great question, Art. The free market, one of the knocks against free market capitalism is it is a, quote, rush to the bottom. That a business person will squeeze every penny out of the cost of his product or service to put more money in his pocket. And at some point, when all the businessmen in a specific market are competing on such a fashion, at some point, the product or service becomes a commodity. There is little profit in it, and it starts destroying all but the strongest in that market. And that is true. It does. But because it destroys, it also creates. There is a constant search in a free market capitalist system for new and improved products, because that's where the margins are going to be. That's where you get the most profit. We can both remember, or at least I can kind of vaguely remember, when you would go to the computer store and you would buy software in a box, and the new software came out and it was $300. And 2 years later, they couldn't give it away. Or it was given away free for other purposes. That was a perfect example of the destruction that leads to the creativity. Hey, that's why we're not stuck on Windows 1.0. That's, whatever Windows is now, God knows. That is why we are not stuck with one guy making shoes by hand, because another guy figured out, hey, if we use this machine, I can make not one pair of shoes a day, I can make a pair of shoes every 30 minutes. The free market is the generator of literally everything you can do, present circumstances taken into consideration, and everything you own. There is not a thing you own that is not somebody's dream of getting wealthy. And the net result has been, in a world that since the beginning was stuck in incredible poverty, where the guy made his own stone arrow points, where he made his own sword or made his own club out of a rock, who occasionally got something to eat. We have lifted 90% of the human species out of that extreme poverty in a very short period of time, historically, in less than 200 years. It started here on a large scale, and it has spread across the world. Humankind has never benefited more by any single process than individual liberty and free market has provided.
George, why do you think that we see many politicians has such a negative view of capitalism today after seeing what we have and what we've accomplished? Why do you believe that so many of our politicians and leaders, I shouldn't say so many, but several, have this negative feeling towards capitalism and free market economy?
Well, yeah, many of the anti-establishment folk of the 60s became college professors, and they have been pumping good little socialists into the system for a couple of generations now. AOC, whatever her full name is, apparently has a degree in economics. It was like, somewhere I want to find that professor and just beat the tar out of him. I mean, just like, how did you miss this point? But she is absolutely convinced. The education system the goal is no longer creating people who can think. To a large part, much of the education system, the goal is creating people who can recite back that they have been told. Heck, my parent can do that. That's not education. Education is being critical of what you are presented, being critical and thinking about how to put things together, not blindly regurgitating what you've been told. And unfortunately, many places, that's not the standard. The standard is repeat after me, congratulations, you get an A. Here's your receipt, you're educated. Wrong.
George, you and I have lived through most of the Cold War. And I read the statement, and please respond to it. This author stated that it truly was free market capitalism that caused the destruction and demise of the communism in the Soviet Union.
Oh, I think that's absolutely supportable. Even at the height of the Cold War, I'm in the Army, there's tanks on the border in Germany, and I would tell people, this war will not be over when American tanks roll into Moscow. This war will be over when the Russians open the Moscow Stock Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not a big fan of Mr. Putin, but things are certainly infinitely better in a almost free market Russia than they were under the Soviets.
And we're going to continue this discussion on our next show, but where do you see today, George, where is our free market capitalistic system today dealing with the communism around the world today?
That complex question, Art. We definitely, and I'm not sure how to respond to it. Unlike when the 50s and even the 60s and 70s, when it was free market West versus socialist East, that no longer exists. The standing joke is there's more communists in Washington than there are in Moscow. And that's meant to be a joke, but it's not far off either.
Yeah.
So the clear lines, geographic lines of division are no longer there. We have people who have been a product of, like AOC, a product of at best, mediocre education, who are, Fidel Castro would sit there and say, "What the heck's the matter with you?"
Tragically so. So I apologize for asking a question that apparently has a complex answer. We're up against the time. George, please share with our listeners, again, the name of your book and where they're able to purchase your book, please.
Thank you very much, Arch. The book is entitled Guaranteed to Fail, Socialism Has Not Worked Because Socialism Cannot Work. It is not a per se political tone, but it is the organizational look at how socialism continuously fails. It cannot work from the human organizational experience. It is available on Amazon. It is downloadable on whatever that electronic thing is.
Kindle?
Kindle. There was that magic word. I may be old, but I'm slow. So I would highly, it's an easy read. It's not an academic piece. It is a read that a high schooler can pick up and actually understand why socialism fails, not just once or twice, but every time.
Every time. So we are going to continue the discussion in our next show with Dr. Anderson. So Dr. Anderson, thank you for coming and sharing with us, and we're going to continue our conversation with you in our next show. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
This is WFYL, Working for Your Liberty, 1180 AM.
The Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.
When you experience the loss of a loved one, you can trust the Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory to guide you through the arrangements necessary to create a meaningful ceremony that celebrates the unique life being honored. Our staff is committed to providing your family with the highest quality of care and service in your time of need. We take pride in our responsibility to lighten your burden as you take the first step towards healing. Ask us about how we create a unique service for your loved one. Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory also helps with planning ahead so all the details of the service are taken care of. Ask us how we can connect you with grief support networks in your area. Spender-Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory has the resources to compassionately guide you through the loss of your loved one.
Contact us at 610-272-1941. That's 610-272-1941. Or visit our website at myersfh.com. That's MEYERSFH.com.
Good morning and welcome to Our American Heritage. I am March Hunter, the host of the program. The American Heritage is a program where we explore in depth the American experience from the beginning to the present. And again, today we want to welcome back Dr. George Anderson. Dr. Anderson, thank you for joining us and welcome back.
Good morning. Thank you again for having me.
Dr. Anderson has written a book, Guaranteed to Fail, Socialism Does Not Work Because Socialism Cannot Work. And in our previous show, Dr. Anderson was talking to us about the background and history of capitalism and where it came from and how capitalism has evolved in America. And we left Dr. Anderson with what he said was a complicated question about where is our fight against communism today with our free market system that we share today. So, Dr. Anderson, if you would like to pick it up from there, we'll try to continue on, and I'll try not to ask complicated questions.
If the world and history were only simplistic.
Yes.
I wanted to talk just a little bit within that free enterprise system about what we call the nature of capital. Capital is usually defined as the tools of production, or the money to buy the tools of production. So if a hammer costs $10 and you can build a house with a hammer, either the $10 in your hand or the hammer in your hand is capital for you to go make that house. The large, in the early industrial revolution, many of the jobs were unskilled labor, where an immigrant would get off the boat, someone in my family tree, and a young Irishman running from the famine. He was not literate. He had no technological skills. He was looking for a job that he could feed himself and hopefully a family, that didn't require anything but his labor. Millions of Americans arrived that way. And the early industrial revolution showed that. The jobs in the early factories were pretty terrible, because the labor was easily exchanged. The company gave the miner a pick, gave the miner a shovel, and if you didn't like it, there's a man behind you that would be glad to take the job. So things were pretty rough, were very rough for those folks. And they got, in the early 19th century, they got a lot of press. The jungle, the octopus, the muckrakers of the early 20th century. They told some very grim tales about a grim existence at the bottom, the bottom of the scale in the free enterprise system. Those same tales, to a large extent, drive the socialist agenda. The poor, downtrodden worker. Those times are real. And the poor, downtrodden worker did exist. But corporations need people to be organizations. They need people to produce. And the nature of that worker over the last 100 years has changed dramatically. If you look at a corporation, very successful corporations, like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon, the technological companies don't hire somebody and then hand them a hammer or hand them a shovel or hand them a pick. They hire people for what that person has in their head. That person is the hammer, is the shovel, is the pick. That person's knowledge and ability is what allows the organization to grow and prosper. The coal miner of the 19th century was interchangeable with some poor guy who just got off the boat. A programmer at Google is not interchangeable. When Google shuts its doors at night, 98% of the real assets, the real capital of Google goes home. And if they don't feel appreciated, if they are not being treated properly, they don't come back. The 19th century coal miner had almost nothing. The 21st century Google employee has gymnasiums, has God knows what they have out there in Silicon Valley. You know, it's like anything to keep the employees happy. The image of the downtrodden employee is the exact opposite of what's going on in modern companies. Free enterprise created that knowledge work base. It was free enterprise that ultimately took the coal miner of the 19th century and created the programmer of the 21st century. It's and that's in amazingly short historic time. There is not a middle-class American today, no matter what his job is, there's not a middle-class American today that does not live better than any Caesar in the history of the Roman Empire. Mm. And it is because of the free market.
And we see that many people claim today, particularly in Washington, that capitalism suppresses people. You gave us examples of the muckrakers, the robber barons, and is it not the government that stopped unfettered capitalism so that workers could be appreciated and protected and earn a decent living?
Sure. I mean, the government almost universally gets in the way. At the turn of the 20th century, there was the term the robber barons. And the robber barons were incredibly wealthy men. There was an incredible concentration of wealth in private hands. Much of it had not yet grown into corporate ownership. And people like Teddy Roosevelt became famous as a trust buster. One guy owned an entire industry. You had to break it up because you had lost the competition within the industry. It used to be called price fixing. You get 4 or 5 guys that control an industry. They get together, they have a cigar, they have a beer, and they decide, they're going to fix their prices, and then they won't have to compete against each other. You have to break that up. That's not free enterprise. That's price fixing. And then all of a sudden, the guys were smart enough to figure out, hey, if we do that amongst ourselves over a cigar and a drink, that's price fixing. We can go to jail for that. What we need is government regulation. So they went to Washington and basically run price fixing through Washington. And if the government imposes government regulation, holy moly, look at that. We're in compliance with the law and they're locked in. Let me give you an example of your basic local power company. Your basic local power company, and it makes perfect sense to have a power company, not multiple power companies competing. But a power company provides things that are vital for civilization. And the government, we should all recognize that. I hate it when I flick the switch and the lights don't go on. But as a company, they are subject to government regulation. They have an oversight board, and they are guaranteed a profit. So no matter how badly they are run, no matter how many mistakes they make, all they have to do is go to the regulatory board and they are granted a price raise, a cost raise. They are guaranteed to make money. I have limited control over who I can buy what from. And now we deregulated, became more, here in Pennsylvania, became more free market enterprise. So we now have choices who we can buy it from. But 10 years ago, that wasn't true. PICO provided everything. And, we got, as Jerry Reed said, some people get the elevator and some people get the shaft.
I remember when President Reagan deregulated the airline industry, and I was saying to someone last week that actually airline tickets are cheaper today than they were during the 1980s because airlines have been deregulated. Would that be another example of what you're talking about?
Absolutely. Free enterprise, free competition. Although I have to say, I think the seats were wider and the attendants were better looking. But,
well, George, I think 30 years ago, you and I probably weren't as wide as we are today either. So
I suspect we were both better looking 30 years ago.
I would agree with that.
The other thing Reagan did was he busted up Ma Bell. We had one provider of telephonic services, and he broke it up into competing companies. And within 10 years, 15 years, we had the internet, we had cell phones, things. If Ronald Reagan had not broken up Ma Bell, there would still be a single provider, and we would still have walls or phones hanging off of walls.
George, you gave us examples of how in the turn of the century with the muckrakers and the robber barons, and some people had that idea where today, is capitalism suppressing people today?
Capitalism liberates people. Capitalism, the ability to provide a good or service that people want, drives human progress. 90% of human progress has been made in the last 200 years, largely due to capitalism. Henry Ford didn't sit there and say, wouldn't it be great if the world had a car? Because I'm a philanthropist. Henry Ford said, how can I make a car cheap enough that everybody in America can buy it so I can get filthy rich? I once had a college professor ask me, is giving away, an American company gave away a pharmaceutical that cured a terrible disease. Was this an act of altruism, or was this an act of a capitalist pig company? And the reply, of course, was not A or B. The reply was C. It's a stupid question. Because the people who were cured of the disease didn't care what the motivation was. If it profited the American company, they were better. And that's what mattered to them. As I said in the prior show, there is not a thing you can do, there is not a thing that you own which is not driven by somebody's profit motive.
And for so many years, George, because my wife is in the pharmaceuticals industry, we've heard such criticism of big pharma, and yet particularly we see now as we're coming through and hopefully coming out of the whole COVID situation, it is big pharma and private industry that has supplied Americans with so much of the medical equipment that we see that. So all of a sudden, and big pharma is trying to come up with vaccines. Now all of a sudden, big pharma and private sector is not the evil that so many people have said before this all happened.
Yeah. This time last year, big pharma was evil because they made a profit. This time, the same people are saying, "Where was big pharma? Don't they have a cure for this already?" I don't think people appreciate that America, big pharma in America, is big pharma. Period. Yeah, and as much of it is here in the Philadelphia area. That these people provide new solutions and new drugs and new therapies, not just for the United States, but for the world. Their formulas get stolen and made, replicated elsewhere. That's absolutely true. But you don't see cures coming for diseases from Zimbabwe. You don't see it happening from Korea, which is a sophisticated driving company. You don't see it coming from China. They can make the disease pretty well, but not so much the cure. It's America pharma is global pharma, and the results have been amazingly positive for the entire human race.
Again, as you and I lived through a lot of the Cold War, we as a nation dealt with the Soviet Union on a far different level than we in the past 30 or 35 years have dealt with communist China. What do you believe, or how should we be dealing with communist China with our free market capitalist system that we have?
China is an amazing beast. When the Westerners arrived in the Far East, it literally took the Chinese about 150 years of granting, colonies and getting chopped up by Britain and France and Portugal. 150 years of that, and the Chinese finally figured out that maybe something wasn't quite right. They can be very insular, but they are also very long-term players. The brilliance of Mao was not his economic policies, but the fact that he basically drove out all the Westerners. All his economic policies were absolutely tragic in massive terms, and even the Chinese will admit that. But now they have sort of a peculiar mixture that only the Chinese can sustain, having a one-party communist system, but at the same time an almost free economic system, where individual Chinese are now being rewarded for their efforts. They're not Hong Kong. Most of China would love to be Hong Kong, but they're a lot better off than they were under the days of Mao. Does China want to expand and be the world player? I think there is no doubt about it. China has always perceived itself as the center of the universe. Does that mean they are capable of it? Probably not. Doesn't mean that one should not be cautious. But at the same time, they have some real challenges that other places don't. I mean, the Chinese wet markets where you can go buy a bat to eat. Well, they're eating bats because they need to eat anything that, provides nourishment. I mean, with 1.2 billion people now, some of the estimates are that as many as 27 million Chinese might have died from this virus. When you have 1.2 billion, nobody notices 27 million gone. It's just like the numbers are, the size of the place and the population is mind-boggling. It's just staggering. And they are the center of the world, and they feel that they should be the major, at least a major player. So.
George, with the attacks that we see on our free market capitalistic system from within our country right now and for the past several years, where do you see in your crystal ball, where do you see where our free market system is heading in the future?
Well, very good question, Arch. First, I want to have one tie back to China.
Okay.
During the Chinese Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek would tell people that, that the communists were there and the Japanese were there, and it was a real mess during the 40s. But he would tell people that the Japanese were a disease of the skin and the communists were a disease of the soul.
Oh.
And that is, I think, very much true today. We see a current administration who is dedicated to the free market, who has done an amazing job in reducing the burden of government through the elimination of regulations, who has clarified our position globally, who has strengthened our military, who is unabashedly proud of being a nationalist. I mean, one of the first things the man did is he stood up in the United Nations and said, "I'm not the president of the world, I'm the president of the United States. Get over it." In many ways, he's a throwback to the likes of Teddy Roosevelt or even Andrew Jackson. And he doesn't sit well with an establishment that is New World Order, which is acquiescing to international organizations as governmental bodies, which is thinking in global terms, not nationalistic terms, and thinking in more government intervention, socialistic terms. When I was a kid, I literally passed out "I like Ike" buttons at the train station. And I can remember my father saying, "Yeah, we like Ike, but there's not really a whole lot of difference between the two political parties." That is not the case in this election.
Yeah.
We probably are more polarized in worldview, in intent, than we've ever been since the 60s. And this election is certainly pivotal to which vision of American future will ultimately prevail. It's important in the extreme. If we are going to hold that which made us a nation, individual liberty, individual rights, individual responsibility, versus corporate governmental action.
And as we wrap up, George, the opponents of free market capitalism, they point towards the super wealthy, and they never talk about what free market capitalism has produced is the middle class in America, where you said that we have more as the middle class than ever any Caesar ever had in Rome. Why is it that they emphasize the super wealthy and they never talk about it has produced this massively secure, economic, stable middle class?
Good question. And obviously, it's hard for me to conceptualize. Some of it's about power, Arch.
Power.
What good is being a ruler if you don't have a mass to rule? If you decide you're part of the intellectual, social, political elite, you got to have somebody that isn't, or you're nothing. So, it's you go out there and you convince people out of jealousy and fear and anger that somebody else is out to hurt them, when just the opposite is true. Then you get, you can get elected to be governor of Pennsylvania.
Sadly so. Dr. Anderson, thank you. Again, share with our listeners your book, where they can purchase it. And we certainly want to thank you for talking the last couple of shows about the history of capitalism, where it is in America, and how we need to preserve it.
Thank you for having me. The name of the book is Guaranteed to Fail. Socialism has not worked because socialism cannot work. And it is available on Amazon.
So again, George, thank you for coming and sharing with our listeners today. So thank you very much. You are one of our favorite people that come on to be interviewed. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
This is WFYL 1180, working for your liberty.
The Spender Myers Funeral Home and the Bakke Funeral Home and Crematory are proud sponsors of Our American Heritage.